오늘 이 자리에 함께 하신 분들이 좋은 시간이 되고 많이 배워가셨으면 좋겠다라는 생각을 갖고 있습니다. 우선 그 첫 번째 시간으로 그 할리우드 영화 제작사에서 컴퓨터 그래픽 슈퍼바이저로 활동하고 있는 그레이크 린 감독님께서 게임을 넘어서는 미래 기술 리얼타임 렌더링이라는 주제로 강연을 해주시겠는데요. 그레이크 린 감독님께서는 엑스박스용 게임뿐만이 아니라 여러 게임들의 그 시각 효과를 선도하시는 그런 분입니다. 저 역시 게임 산업 정책을 10년 정도 담당을 하고 있어서 매우 큰 관심을 갖고 있는 주제라고 할 수 있겠습니다. 그럼 여러분들의 박수와 함께 크레이그 린 선생님들을 모시도록 하겠습니다.
Thank you. I'm sure that was a great introduction. I wish I understood what it was, but I'm sure it was remarkable. I'd like to start by thanking everyone at DICON for inviting me here. It's a great honor. It's fantastic to speak. It's kind of interesting in a lot of ways because, as our keynote speaker mentioned before, there's two things that are important, and it's very important for Korea as well, funny enough. The first word that's important is convergence. And it will make sense a little bit later on why convergence is important. And the second one is pivot. And why am I saying pivot? Because right now, with where we are from a technology and creative point of view in the world, we're at a pivot point. And this is why it's kind of interesting about what I'm going to start talking about. First of all, a brief overview. Real-time rendering engines. In general, these used to be the remit of gaming, right? So for example, with the Xbox, PlayStation 4, and so on, all of these take advantage of real-time gaming engines, right? What I'm here to talk about is other uses for that. A quick backgrounder on myself. I'm from the visual effects side of film, so I don't usually use gaming engine in what we do. And this is why it's kind of interesting. Very quickly, the project that I used this for was for an Xbox commercial. And it's to promote Ryse, which is the next generation video game coming onto the new generation Xbox One, which just debuted a couple of weeks ago. This was done in conjunction with my producing partner right over there, Kimber Lim. She can wave to you. And it's a project for Microsoft, and this is why it's kind of interesting. In the past, what we used to do is render in the most traditional sense, and I'm going to go into a little bit of a background of it, because not very many people understand really what the word rendering means, so I'm going to hit that up in a quick second. So like I was saying, it was to promote a video game called Ryse, Son of Rome, and it was developed by a company called Crytek. And Crytek has a real-time rendering engine, and this is the key bit of technology that we're going to be discussing today. The whole concept of a real-time rendering engine is that you're going to be able to start using it for different applications than what you traditionally used to use it for. I'm going to break the talk up into two separate parts. The first is really kind of a case study of the rendering engine and how we used it for the ad. And then the second bit, which is more important, is the potential future uses of a real-time rendering engine. Now, before we really get into the nitty-gritty of it, I kind of wanted to go into what a rendering engine was, because we throw these terms around all the time. And it kind of gets complicated. We get bogged down in a lot of technology and terminology. And I think it'd be best to go into what the process is required of what it takes to really get a picture on the screen. Because once you understand what it takes to get a picture on the screen, it'll then make sense what a rendering engine does. Now, the first step of the entire process is modeling. Not in the traditional sense of modeling, but what we talk about comes from the origin of CAD. So for example, way back in the day when we used to do architecture, engineering, and so on, we'd start with a 3D wireframe. So the modeling process is actually building our geometry, you know. I really like to use the analogy of a plastic model airplane kit, because it can take you through the entire process of what modeling is about. So we start with a wireframe, right? You know, very simple sort of representation of our world. The next step is to start to paint it, right? Texture painting, right? Which is the traditional art of actually painting maps to go onto the geometry. And in our case, it's a flat 2D texture map. All this is reprojected onto the geometry. And then the next step is this, and this is the most critical and crucial part of understanding what we're talking about, which is rendering, right? The analogy that I use for rendering is this. It's kind of like in the photography world when you have to develop an image or a photo. So you go out there, you snap a picture of something, and then you have to process it in order to see it. So in the same way in our digital world, we start with a 3D model, like I showed you before. We put a texture map on it, and then we render it. So after a certain amount of time, depending on the rendering technology that we use, we end up with a picture, right? Now, to give you a little bit of a background, though, of like traditional rendering, way back in the day in film, for example, when we're working on large budget movies, our rendering time can go through the roof. In other words, for every single frame that we have to render, it can sometimes take hours. Now, here's a lovely image that I love to show. This is from Jurassic Park. Way back in the day, I was at a company called ILM, and we did movies such as Star Wars and so on. And this image is really funny because this is one of the ones that everyone refers to when we talk about how long rendering used to take. If you look at this image, at one point in the movie, the T-Rex's tail slides across frame, right? It's very blurry. It takes a long time to process. That one frame took over 48 hours to render. Now, wow, one frame, 48 hours. Then you start doing your little bit of math. If you look at your standard film, every single second on screen is composed of 24 frames. You can start adding that up, and it gets to be a really long time just for 1 minute worth of footage. So, what does that have to do with gaming engines? Well, a few years back, gaming engines, everyone started talking about, wow, you know, this is the technology, it's really cool. From the video game world, you know, they were saying, this is the next big thing. It's 3D graphics, it's on par with film. You know, we looked at it and said, well, really, maybe not yet. But today, when we look at the new gaming engines coming out, we're literally almost there, and that's what makes this so exciting. Gaming technology is finally getting close to film quality visual effects. Now, this is the whole concept of convergence and why it gets so interesting. A number of things and a number of technologies are coming together. The first one is powerful, inexpensive graphics cards. These are consumer-level graphics cards from the gaming industry that we're able to start using to start processing images, right? These are off-the-shelf pieces of kit. The next bit of technology that's really exciting is a renaissance of virtual reality. So this is stereo VR in combination with a real-time gaming engine and cheap hardware. The next bit, motion simulator seating. You start tying all of these together and you have a completely immersive experience. Now, this is why, I mentioned earlier, why I think that Korea is one of the key places for this technology. With most of your seating in your theaters nowadays starting to take advantage of motion-based seating, as well as a very strong industrial consumer-level hardware companies, for example, Samsung, investing in these technologies, you're going to start to see a new renaissance, a new paradigm in visual storytelling. In combination with that, you have a very mature visual effects industry as creative content providers. So, What does that mean for the future? What's coming down the pipe? Obvious applications, which are the simple ones, are military simulations, medical training, and then a little bit further down the line, feature animation. So what does this mean? What I'm talking about now is this, and this is why it's so cool. If you start taking advantage of real-time rendering with virtual reality stereo goggles, as well as motion-based seating, you have a new means of telling stories. The nearest paradigm that I can draw to this is Imax. Why Imax? What does Imax have to do with anything? Imax was a technology that was introduced, probably ahead of its time. And what they had to do, which is they had to develop their own venues to take advantage of their technology, which is a large negative, a large high-quality piece of film. In the same way, to take advantage of this new technology, which is real-time rendering, we're going to need new venues, which is probably the biggest barrier to entry that we're going to be facing. Now, here's an interesting sort of image, right? This is a still from the ad that we did. You ask the average person, what do they see and why is it important to them, right? I look at it from a different point of view. You see, because the average punter off the street says, yes, it's a guy in a gladiator outfit walking up a set of stairs. What I see instead of that is real-time volumetric lighting coming from the side, a hair simulation that's calculated on the fly, as well as a high-res image, which is rendered at HD quality in real time. An image like this as well, which was generated from the ad. What do I see? Well, I see a lot of geometry in a scene that's also being processed on the fly. I see multiple streams of animation in the background, as well as very high-res texture maps in the scene. Same again here. Very elaborate sets rendered in real time. The final image here is kind of proof in the pudding. This too is a still from the render. We have a real-time hair sim in there, as well as additional things such as subsurface scattering. Traditionally, when we used to render in visual effects for film quality effects, each one of these frames taking upwards of an hour. Nowadays, they're being calculated in real time. What I wanted to show you next is this. Which is the actual ad itself. The first part of the ad is live action, and then the last 5 shots in here are what was rendered using the real-time rendering engine.
Rated M for mature.
Just a man.
We've heard he's a god.
They say he seeks vengeance. I hear he seeks the truth.
He's coming.
I know it.
To save us.
To bury us.
Only on Xbox One.
So the next step that I'd like to show you is the kind of the interface, which is our front end into this sort of technology. So stopping here, right here, is this. What you see here is the general interface that your average artist used to interface with the real-time rendering engine. So like I mentioned before, all this geometry, these texture maps, are created in advance in another application, then it's brought into this environment to basically start dressing. In the same way that, the nearest analog that I like to use is this, is like being on set. This is why it's important. So when we look through this viewport, this frame right here that you're seeing is actually a final frame that we would be seeing in the final render. Why that's important is this, is that we can go in there and start manipulating parts of the world in real time. Before, like I said, we used to have to render everything. So every time that we would make an adjustment, so example, move a light, change a camera, or so on, we'd have to re-render this single image. So before, we'd be waiting 2 hours. Now, we're doing it in a matter of seconds. The other interesting advantage of using this technology is speed. When we start building or creating sets or worlds, we can start doing things such as manipulating geometry in real time. And also navigate a very complex world. If you look down there on the side, one of the interesting things as well is this, is that if you look at the reflections being cast on the wall, which we call caustics, which is down here, all those are also being calculated on the fly. And like any good set designer, one of the other interesting aspects of this is this. You can access libraries worth of data and swap them out. You don't like the door? Change the door. There are also effects and asset libraries as well. Most of these game engines also have physics engines involved in them. For example, this is a real-world particle simulation. As well as animated texture maps that you can use for fire effects. And it's very interesting and important to look at something like this here. All these characters in here have individual animation sequences assigned to them, as well as the ability to go in there and change individual assets. For example, helmets, costumes, coloration, texture maps. The other good thing is that it uses an industry standard front end, which is Maya, for things such as animation, scene building, rigging. And that's data streamed real time into the rendering engine. Specular highlights, glows, bump maps, all being calculated in real time. Hair systems and cloth simulations can be passed as alembic data sets, which in some ways is important. What it is complex data sets are being passed without rigging or simulation. For example, the hair simulations. Advanced lighting, such as area lights, are also being supported. And while all this technology jargon sounds a little bit overwhelming, at the end of the day, what it boils down to is this, is just a more realistic render. So in a lot of ways, what this talk was about was the first side of it is this, is the case study of what you can use currently a real-time rendering engine for. The interesting aspect of it is the potential uses next week or next year for the data. So, if there are any questions that I can answer on this, I'd be more than happy.
네, 감사합니다. 무엇보다도 발표자께서 시간을 너무 잘 지켜주셔서 일단 감사드리고요. 그 시간이 충분한 만큼 질의응답은 충분히 가질 수 있도록 그렇게 하겠습니다. 지금 렌더링 엔진 기술을 활용한 다양한 영역의 창출, 그 다음에 그 창출로 통해서 미래의 어떤 새로운 패러다임이 만들어질 것이다 라는 게 굉장히 인상적이었고요. 특히나 다양한 어플리케이션을 활용을 해서 렌더링 기술을 접목한 작업들이 가능하고 그런 작업들이 복잡성에서 좀 탈피해서 효율화되고 단순화될 수 있다. 그런 말씀들을 해주신 것 같습니다. 다시 한번 감사드리고요. 그럼 지금부터 한 10분간 Q&A 시간을 갖도록 하겠습니다. 굉장히 관심이 많으신 만큼 질의가 많으실 걸로 생각하는데요. 일단 손을 들어주시면 저희가 마이크를 옮겨드릴 수 있도록 그렇게 하겠습니다. 네, 질문 자유롭게 해주시죠.
네, 저는 지금 영화를 공부하는 학생이고요. 이제 3D 실시간 렌더링 기술의 끝은 이제 홀로그램이라고 생각을 했는데 지금은 저희가 스크린을 향해 바라보고 있는 상태로 관객을 배치하게 되는데 만약 렌더링 기술이 발전해서 홀로그램으로 구현하게 된다면은 과연 관객 배치를 어떤 방식으로 하는 게 가장 좋을지 그거에 대한 의견을 한번 물어보고 싶습니다.
Excellent question. And here's the interesting thing about it. Basically, what's happening right now is that we're changing the way that we think about storytelling, right? This happened before in the past when, for example, sound was added to movies. The next time that happened was when color was introduced. And then the latest set of ways as filmmakers we've changed our way of dealing with telling a story is stereo. For example, I've worked on films before where we change our camera composition, we change our cut, we change the way that a shot is designed because of stereo. It's a great question because in a lot of ways, and you're already thinking ahead, is that how are we going to change the way that we tell stories now using virtual reality? Because before, when we look at the screen, we were stuck in one camera position, right? What we're able to do now is that when we set up a shot and we're going from cut to cut, we have a viewer that can start turning around and looking at different things. How do we deal with that as a storyteller? To be honest with you, we don't know yet. But on that note, there's things that we've already started to discuss. For example, in your traditional POV shot, which is usually a handheld, that is a great sort of area when you get into the cut and you're cutting a movie, for example, using this sort of new technology, where you'd give the viewer the ability to look around and pan. But let's just say you cut to a 3/4 wide, At that point, do we just lock off the camera? So in other words, we still have the ability to show a stereo wide shot, but do we just say, even if you turn your head, it's frozen in place? We don't know yet, because once we start cutting these films together, that's what we'll find out. It's a great question, and the other part about it that's really interesting is that we're going to have to relearn how to watch films. Because in ye olde days, they used to have really long cuts. They'd run a shot from a wide shot all the time, and they'd never cut in for coverage. Now, when people, and after a while, when they started with these fast cuts, this happened with the MTV generation, all these fast cuts, people were saying, oh wow, this is very confusing. Younger kids loved it though. They were taught to watch something differently. We're going to have to be rewriting the way we tell stories.
네, 또 질문 있으신가요?
Oh, I can't get off this easy.
네, 자유롭게 질문해 주시기 바랍니다. 질문이 없으시면 제가 하나 좀 드려볼까요? 지금 렌더링 엔진 기술의 활용을 쉽게 군사 시뮬레이션 또는 의료 치료용, 그 다음에 애니메이션 게임 이런 컨텐츠에 이제 적용하는 것들로 되어 있는데 이런 것 위에 아까 말씀하신 것처럼 다양한 영역의 렌더링 엔진이 활용될 수 있다고 했는데요. 미래 세대에 이거 말고 또 다른 영역으로 활용할 수 있는 것들이 좀 있을까 싶네요.
Really interesting question. That's the whole interesting aspect of this is real-time rendering. Well, think back around 3 or 4 years ago, or maybe a little bit longer. The nearest quality movie that we're at right now would be Final Fantasy, Spirits Within, feature length. The first probably aspects of this technology would be feature animation. It makes perfect sense. It suits the genre. It suits the quality of the rendering engine. The other ones that everyone keeps on talking towards is military simulation and training, but in combination with the motion-based seating. They've been doing that for years. I think that it's going to become more and more commonplace in the home, though. For example, major motion-based seating manufacturers, which have already started to make inroads in Korean theaters, they're starting to build lower-cost units for the house. That's another area that this real-time rendering can be used. Basically, the key to thinking about this is that anywhere that you need your results to change on the fly, what does that mean? So, for example, sporting events. If you were in there and you were watching the America's Cup race, they used real-time rendering for that. Other obvious uses for it as well, gaming is where it all came from. Any sort of paradigm where speed is important, any sort of data visualization, which is a very dry way of putting it. I think the exciting part about it, though, is using it from an exploration point of view. Dark ride technology. Think about Disneyland. Think about things such as Buzz Lightyear in Tokyo Disneyland. All of these are potential avenues for use for this technology.
네. 마이크 갖다 주시죠. 죄송합니다만 소속하고 좀 말씀해 주시고요. 질문을 해 주셨으면 좋겠습니다.
전 지난 5월 달에 카네기 멜론 대학을 졸업했고요. 제가 드리고 싶은 질문은 지금 리얼타임 렌더링이 산업 구조 자체를 바꾼다고 하셨는데 그러면 그러니까 인력 구조 같은 거나 아니면 잡마켓에서 어떤 변화가 있을지 그걸 여쭤보고 싶었어요. 그러니까 어떤 형태의 기술자들이 필요하고 그러니까 인력이 부족한 상황이 있는지.
Carnegie Mellon, excellent school. A little bit of both. As a funny background, I was an English lit major, which has nothing to do with the industry that I'm in right now. When I was hired at ILM, they said they were looking for a well-rounded individual. I think that same sort of statement applies, is just well-rounded individuals who can actually think. for this type of industry, it's going to change. It's like I said, this is a pivot point. So, as Jeff Oken was saying earlier, content creation as well as storytelling, or whichever you want to call it, is going to become more individual. What does that mean? The tools, the technology are becoming more accessible to the home user. So the interesting thing is this: when I started to learn how to model back in the day at ILM, I used a high-end CAD package, which was nearly impossible to get your head around. Nowadays, though, you can go online to Google Sketch, and you're able to build pretty complex 3D geometry in a web browser. I think that the type of individual that you need is someone at the end of the day with a good eye and a good sense behind it, because the tools are becoming so accessible and commonplace. At the end of the day, you know, it's not just filmmakers that would be using these tools. It's for people that need to be able to tell complex bits of information and distill it down into a visual form that's easier to recognize. You know, like I mentioned, another great avenue for this technology is actually education. For example, if you look at difficult ideas to get your head around, like the atomic structure of an atom, if you tell a child you have a proton, a neutron, and several electrons flying around, I don't really know what that means, even as an adult. But if you were able to visualize something like that from a virtual reality standpoint, and then go down and sit within an atom and show someone that, I think just the applications for this are endless.
또 질문 있으신가요? 네, 없으신가요? 네, 그러면 더 이상 질문이 없으신 걸로 알고요. 이상으로 첫 번째 강연을 마치도록 하겠습니다. 렌더링 엔진의 미래 가능성에 대해서 역설해 주신 우리 크레이그 린 감독님께 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드리겠습니다.
Thank you very much, everyone.